through an anti-racist lens. My name is Victoria Thompson. I'm very glad to be here with you all today. If any of you are on Twitter, you can follow me at Victoria the Tech. I'm very active on Twitter and I'm also very friendly. So if you have any questions or anything like that afterwards, feel free to reach out for sure. And again, very excited to be speaking with you on this today because as of recent, I mean, it's always been happening, but I feel like this month particularly, I don't know if it's because it's Black History Month, but there's just been a lot of nonsense going around on social media, resources, tech tools, all that stuff. It's really important for us to not only vet resources, but also do them with this type of lens of thinking, because we don't want to unintentionally harm our learners. And that's what today's all about. So I always talk a little bit about me before I get started and talking some more. So I am Victoria Thompson again. I'm a proud product of New Jersey K through 12 public education. So I grew up in New Jersey, born and raised. However, I don't live there, obviously. I live in the Seattle area. So I live in Tacoma, Washington, which is where I'm video conferencing in today. I am a former math and science educator in South Carolina and Washington State. And I was there for about like 4.5-ish years. My current role is that of a STEM integration transformation coach. So that's really fun and honestly great because I get to leverage my STEM experience, but I'm helping teachers essentially be better with STEM, project-based learning, and incorporate STEM into everyday lessons and things like that. On top of that, what's really neat about my school site is that it's project-based learning, and it utilizes project-based learning as a vehicle for equity, which is really, really cool. And I'm a technology and education consultant for companies across the Seattle area and beyond. And if you follow me on social media, you will find out very quickly that I love bread and baking. So I am a bread lover. So I always like to begin by giving just a brief synopsis of what EdTech is. And I think we all understand EdTech as tools, but EdTech is more than tools. It's also a discipline. So educational technology really refers to the field of study that investigates the process of or analyzing, designing, developing, implementing, and evaluating the instructional environment and learning materials in order to improve teaching and learning. And I say this because so often when I work with companies or I go into schools, they think that giving a kid a Chromebook is going to solve all the problems, right? Or maybe, okay, well, we're using Google Classroom, so you should be able to access everything. We know as educators, that's not the reality, right? There can be internet connectivity issues. There can also be issues with platforms, right? There can be a whole host of stuff. But at the end of the day, when we think about resources and technology, right? Because a lot of the stuff that we do now is virtual, and that's how we do find out a lot of our materials. We should be doing all these things. We should be analyzing, right? We should be developing, implementing, evaluating. That evaluation piece is crucial when we vet resources together. Via edtechmagazine.com in 2015, so that's a couple, like about 5-6 years ago, about 63% of K-12 teachers use technology in the classroom on a daily basis. That could be anything from just checking in, that could be a form, that could be a full-scale project, but 63% of course daily, and this number is only increasing due to virtual learning and other educational opportunities. So that's kind of the backdrop for EdTech. It's a lot, but I can't remember the last time that I went into a media center and got like a paper pencil like teaching document. Even some of the stuff that like my school gives me in a book, I can look it up online, right? Because online is more fluid, it's updated more. So I tend to get a lot of my resources on the internet. You know, Twitter is a great place to learn for resources. There are lots of trusted websites and organizations that put out some great stuff. So that's why I always give that lens of EdTech, because honestly, that's where we do get a lot of our information. Now, with respect to that, we also have to be respectful of our students and know the kind of fields that we're stepping into. So when we think about resources and when we think about best experiences for our kids, we got to think about culture. So when I think what is culture, and this is from the dismantlingracism.org resource, the link is there, great website. But culture refers to the knowledge, experience, beliefs, values, attitudes, meanings, hierarchies, religions, notions of time, roles, all these things, right? Acquired by a group of people in the course of generations through individual and group striving. Now think of that, that's powerful. Our students are coming into us with lots of different cultures, right? School culture, home culture, right? Religious culture, racial identity, sexual gender identity, right? There's lots of different spaces that our students are coming into, and that intersectionality is what makes them them. And if we want a smaller definition, culture is the knowledge shared by a group of people, right? And I see in the chat box, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Correct. Absolutely. We can't be culturally responsive if we don't know the culture, y'all, right? It's going to make it very, very difficult for us to even get on a baseline, basic level with our students if we don't understand where they're coming from, right? So this is where they're coming from. Now we get to have a heavy conversation about how schools are coming from. Oops. So whenever I show this slide, I do get a couple people that freak out. I'm not calling you a white supremacist. That is not the goal of this slide. The goal of this slide is to explain to you what white supremacy culture is and how this permeates our school environments and really does create inequitable, racist, sometimes, experiences for our students. And it's very important to call it out, because if it's not called out, then we can't vet resources through that anti-racist lens. So white supremacy culture is reproduced by all institutions of our society. Whether we like it or not, whether we think it or not, it is. So in particular, the media, education system, Western science, right? And Western science has played a huge role in reinforcing the idea of race as a biological truth, with white people at the top of the pyramid and everybody else below. They've played central roles in reproducing the idea of white supremacy. And the trademarks of white supremacy are that white is normal, right? White is better, white is smarter, in contrast to Black and other people and communities of color. That's problematic for a whole host of reasons, because one, for education, we don't just teach white students. I've never been in a school environment where it is only white kids. And then second, we're not all white educators, right? So how do these systems kind of play into what we do here? And even outside of education. So my wife is an adult student. She's about to enter nursing, but beforehand she was in the military, you know, majority white men that are in the military. The stuff she's seen and the stuff that was said to her, she had a pilot tell her one time, "I hate flying with Black females like you." That's my dog, hold on. Ren. Ren. Courtney, can you get Ren, please? Sorry, y'all. But in education, what it does is it manifests itself in really many ways, particularly with a couple different things. We have academic tracking, we have pathways, we have discipline, we have curriculum and instructional practices. There's a lot of stuff that goes on there. And to go back to the story about my wife and the pilot, since she just entered the room to get the dog, no, he can be with you. It's fine, yeah, he's with you. One of the things that he said was, "I hate flying with Black females like you." And she's like, "I don't understand. Like, why are you saying that to me right now?" That is something that he said to her in the 21st century, right? The fact that that even crossed his mind to say is just asinine to me. If that's happening with adults, what is even happening with other teachers and students? And I've even heard some things come my way where I get a little quizzical and skeptical. In education, the way that this manifests itself is academic tracking and pathways, right? How many students we know of color are in gifted programs? Discipline, students of color are disciplined at a much higher rate from that of white students. Curriculum, why Black and Brown history and Indigenous history is not a repertoire of curriculum by now is a little shocking to me. And instructional practices. Right? So these are very specific ways that this permeates our culture. So my wife with the military, me in education, we see it differently, but it's all the same. And it's all that culture. Sorry for my dog barking. So now we kind of get to, what does it mean to be an anti-racist, right? We've got the white supremacy culture, we've got culture, we know what ed tech is. How does this all kind of come together as an intersectionality? So previously, so if I think about my parents, my grandparents, everybody else before, the prior rhetoric was racist, not racist, right? Well, I'm not racist, right? Or that's racist. Now the current rhetoric is racist, anti-racist, right? Anti-racist is the goal here. Now, usually when I give talks on this, people are perplexed as to exactly what not racist means, versus anti-racist, because on paper they do look kind of similar, but not racist essentially means I'm not racist, I'm out, right? Like click, this doesn't pertain to me. I am not a racist. You know, this has nothing to do with me. I am not a racist right now, right? So if somebody says something that may be offensive, they might call it out as racist, but they might not actually have any actionable follow-up with that, if that makes sense. Or if somebody accuses somebody of, doing an action that is perceived to be racist, the response was, well, that can't be true because I'm not racist, right? I don't see color is typically a phrase that's used with not racist. However, the new rhetoric is racist, anti-racist. And being an anti-racist means a couple different things. One, you oppose racism. It's not enough for you to not be racist. You have to literally oppose it in every fiber of your being. That's hard. And I sometimes get, feedback from folks where they really want to start on this journey, but they're not exactly sure what to do, what to be, any of that stuff. Baby steps are still steps, right? It starts with calling things out. If maybe somebody makes an insensitive joke, then it snowballs into, okay, well, how can I read a little bit more on this kind of stuff, right? You listen to podcasts, you look for thought leaders on things like this. It's really, really important to oppose racism, not just by saying you're not racist, but following up with your actions. As we all know, actions do speak louder than words. So to say not racist, but then not follow up, that's kind of problematic right now, right? It's always been problematic, but it's even more so being in the 21st century and it being 2021, right? Also, what you're doing is you're acknowledging harmful structures that were created by racism and white supremacy culture, right? Things like academic tracking that is not equitable, right? If you've got an AP program and you don't have a single student of color, time to evaluate that structure and maybe how kids are funneled into that program. Or perhaps, if you've got students of color that are suspended at a higher rate than all of the other students, again, time to look into that structure and dive deep into why. Right? We're acknowledging that these structures are harmful for our students of color, and they're created kind of by this racism and this white supremacy culture. We're also acknowledging harmful structures that promote racism and white supremacy culture in our schools, right? Promoting is so harmful because it maintains that status quo that our students are not going to have equitable experiences. And you'll see what I mean in a few moments. And what we do when we're anti-racist is we're actively working to dismantle these structures to promote and advocate for racial justice. So in its core, if we're looking at the educator perspective, this is kind of the setup for what being an anti-racist looks like. And I guarantee that if you work with students or you work with teachers, there's quite a few that will look and say, yes, I'm an anti-racist, and yes, I'm not racist, and yes, I swear I'm doing all the right things. But we really need to think about how this plays into our resources, teaching practices, and our instructional strategies. We can read the books, we can listen to the podcasts, we can call things out, but for us as educators, how exactly does this show up? And you'll find that sometimes it doesn't match, if that makes sense. So to show you how it doesn't make sense, I'm going to go into a round robin of what I call nonsensical things I've seen this month, starting with this. So I know it's a little blurry with the screen grab, but this is a project that was done by an elementary school. They were learning about slave history. So look at that terminology too, right, y'all? That's important. Slave history. It's not Black history. It's not African-American history. It's not history of enslaved people. It's slave history. And what this was a project where students had to create a poster for slaves at an auction. So you'll notice a couple things, right? Wednesday the 15th, 12 o'clock, Town Square, slaves at the auction. And you'll see 5 different folks that are listed, different ages, and also just different skills that they have. Without even getting into how problematic this is, I would like to just point out, how is this aligned with academic curriculum or instruction? Can anybody tell me clearly how this is aligned in any way, shape, or form with academic instruction? I've never seen a standard where kids are asked to evaluate whether or not slaves are valuable at an auction. That is something I've never seen. Even when I taught in South Carolina, that was something I never saw. Then if we take a look at exactly what this is asking for the students to do, if you were a Black student, how would you feel about that, right? If you were a Japanese student, right, with Japanese internment camps, how might you feel about that? If you're a Jewish student, right, with Holocaust history and literature, how might you feel about that? Slavery is not just Black and African American. And the reason why I picked this is because it's so broad, right? When I see slaves, my mind automatically goes to Black history, but it also means a lot of other different types of things too, right? So to me, this is highly problematic. One, because this could unintentionally harm a learner, right? That could bring back generational trauma if they were part of a group that was enslaved in some way, shape, or form. And then just academically and instructionally, I really don't see how this is aligned, right? And that's part of that anti-racist lens. We're not just doing it for our health, right? We're doing it because we want for our resources to go with what we're teaching our students, but also make sense within the context of cultural competency. This one has been circulating around social media quite a bit. So this was recent, maybe about a week ago. Donald Trump was our 45th president. He was a businessman before he became president. He wanted to help our country. Creating jobs was one of the ways he made the United States better. So this was in a student's like workbook type thing that they were given. A parent posted it on social media. It's kind of been making the rounds and educators have been trashing it for a lot of different reasons, but primarily this of course would discount experiences of folks who were directly harmed by this, quite frankly, very harmful administration to people of color, to queer folks, to folks that don't necessarily identify and fit that mold. It also completely glosses over some of the other things that were going on there, right? Wanted to help our country, creating new jobs. Yeah, but how exactly were those jobs created, right? How exactly were other jobs taken away? How were other folks being disenfranchised here? It kind of paints this very broad brush. And a lot of the response that was given was that, okay, well, they're kids. My pushback is that students are smarter than we think. Students are often some of the smartest folks in the room, right? They can pick up on things like this. And if they were a student who maybe got impacted by this administration, again, it can be extremely harmful for them. So a lot of educators were even saying that they felt harmed just by looking at this, because this is kind of like washed history, right? It doesn't go into the deeper dives and the details. Okay, 2012. Georgia school used a slavery analogy to teach math. These were two different types of analogies. The first analogy, and these were Black slaves, right? So African-American indentured slaves. The first analogy was picking cotton, right? So like if somebody has such and such amount of bushels of cotton and somebody else has it over here, how many bushels do they have together? It seems benign on the onset, but we could have literally used anything. I could have used cherries. I could have used soccer balls. I could have used elephants. I could have used anything. What was the intent of choosing slaves in that problem, right? Feels like they knew what they were doing. The second one was about a slave owner cracking whips on a slave. How many? And again, what was the intent? We could have used anything. We could have used bushels of apples. We could have talked about items at brunch. We could have talked about clipboards for all we care. What was the intent of that? And if you also think about this, you'll notice in the second paragraph, the school district spokeswoman said that they had no reason that there was any intent to the racially infused cross-curricular questions. So they don't believe that there was any intent, but clearly they already could have been, working with other things, right? To me, that's very problematic, because then when a school spokesperson says that there was no ill intent, when clearly there was, right, there's a disconnect there. What's missing? What's missing? And what's missing is that critical thinking piece. They did not vet that resource. Okay, so this question was actually recently asked to me by a colleague, but I get this all the time. Typically, if there's an organization that will give a tool or maybe a set of tools or a platform, one of the biggest questions I receive is, well, do they have a DIE director? DIE stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what that means is there's typically a director that will oversee that, but typically that's for HR purposes, right? Like how many folks of color do we have? Are we retaining folks of color? Why are people leaving? Stuff like that. So I was having a conversation with a colleague the other day. We were going over standards, like tech standards for something. And they were asking, well, does that tech company have a, DIE director? Because if they don't, I just don't know if we should use their products. So I had to say, okay, my pushback is just because there's a presence of diversity, equity, and inclusion in a director doesn't necessarily mean that that company is invested in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because diversity, equity, and inclusion, again, that should be all of our jobs, right? We should all be working towards diversity, equity, and inclusion at our sites. And to go back to what I said previously, most of the DIE stuff that I've seen, right, in corporates and companies and things like that, they're more concerned with retention, right, recruitment. They seldom touch the educational tools or the tech tools. So DIE doesn't necessarily mean that they're invested in the work. Sometimes they have to have one, right? Like sometimes a division pops up and they say, hey, you got to have this diversity, equity, and inclusion. Just because they have a DIE director doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be like some magical thing, right? If there's not a DIE presence at least, then that's definitely cause for concern. But I wouldn't necessarily put the pinnacle at the director, because what happened after that conversation was it ended, right? They didn't talk about processes. They didn't talk about vetting through teachers. They didn't talk about students. They thought that the DIE director did everything. And again, it's everybody's responsibility. That's not necessarily a resource, but that's something that does get said quite often. So then with all these bombs I just dropped on you and my dog barking for about a minute, what do we do, right? What can we actually do in order to vet resources through an anti-racist lens? Because obviously there's a lot of nonsense and we want to do the best, not just for us and our professional growth, but we also want to do the best for our students too. That's the goal, right? Those are the two goals. So here's how we're going to start. First, when we begin, I always tell folks to not go off of blind statements of faith. We've really got to do the research ourselves whenever we take a look at getting a resource or getting a tech tool, any of that stuff. So if I hear from a friend, hey, immersive reader is great, I'm like, okay, I'm going to do research on immersive reader, right? Or if I see a resource, hey, I found this really cool tool on Black History Month, great. I'm also going to do my vetting and make sure that it's an appropriate resource for my students, right? And also for my colleagues if I want to share it out. I just don't go off of blind statements and like forward things when I haven't vetted them. I got to kind of do that myself. And honestly, trust yourself, because that's the best way to move forward. Now, when you're vetting a resource, here are the questions that I go through in my mind. And I think conceptually, right, with my academic content. And then I also think critically, right, with respect to what this might center and how this might impact my students. So first and foremost, because that's probably one of the most important things, does this resource fit with my curriculum? I showed y'all the slave auction, right, poster. I've never seen a standard that asks for students to compare qualities of slaves, right? I've never seen a standard that asks for students to create posters or things like that. Art standards and the creativity process, yes, but again, that doesn't match up with what was displayed here. Does the resource fit with my curriculum? If the answer is no, it's got to be a no-go, right? So even if it's not necessarily like an anti-racist resource, I just kind of start there because then I can turn it into an anti-racist resource. So does it fit with the curriculum? If the answer is no, it gets the boot. If the answer is yes, check, move down to the next one. Who created this resource? Who, right? There are some, of course, resources that have very obvious slants that we need to be very cautious of. Certain government websites, right? Different political parties, and also some communities or collaborative groups that might want to be pushing certain agendas. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that this is bad, but when we think about media bias and different types of bias, we just got to be very careful with our students. I also say this because we don't want to cause any unintentional harm or confusion for our learners. So to give you a little bit of insight onto the confusion, I was working with a group of teachers. They were middle school teachers, and they were doing claim evidence reasoning with them. But the article that they gave them was from the AARP, which is the American Association of Retired Persons. It just didn't make sense, right? So even conceptually, you're giving a group of 6th, 7th, and 8th grade students an article from the AARP and trying to do claim evidence reasoning. So we were able to find them a little bit more of an age appropriate, resource, but who created it, right? That's important. Also, if we think about this, who's the audience for the resource? So even though I'm STEM background, right, I always think about audience, because there are some things that are very obviously made and put out for adults, and there are some things that are a little bit more kid friendly. But when we think audience in terms of vetting resources, what I think is, what's the learning target for my students, right? What exactly do I want them to get out of this experience? And if I can't pinpoint a specific thing, then that's a no-go, right? So if I'm looking at, okay, I'm working with 7th grade students, here's a really neat resource on Women's History Month. If I can't find anything actionable out of it, then it might not be the specific audience for my students. Check. 4th, who is centered in this resource? This is a big one, and probably one of the biggest besides the last one. A lot of resources that I see center what I perceive to be the wrong energy. So to give you examples, right? Read Across America is coming up in March. Dr. Seuss, that's a big thing. Dr. Seuss was also highly problematic. Dr. Seuss performed in blackface. He did a lot of anti-Semitic stuff. So a lot of teachers are kind of thinking of alternative ways to move away from Dr. Seuss, still have Read Across America, but center different authors. Well, when I'm working with some teachers on that, the conversations are still very centered around Dr. Seuss, to the point where somebody asked, well, could we teach a lesson on how and why Dr. Seuss was harmful or problematic? The answer is not necessarily no, right? So I'm like scratching my head, like the answer is not necessarily no, but why are you directing more energy into this man who has shown to be problematic when you can spend that time and energy uplifting folks who deserve that time in that spotlight, right? So just giving opportunities really for people to have that experience to uplift those voices, which is awesome, awesome, awesome. When I also think centering, especially in STEM, I think of how the only Black STEMinist, as I call them, that I learned about was George Washington Carver. And then the only woman that I learned about was Marie Curie. Almost every single scientist or mathematician that I learned about was a white man. And not to discount the work that white men do, but there's a lot more people out there that our students need to learn about and know about. So thinking about centering, who's typically centered in your work? And then on top of that as well, how can we kind of break that mold and move out of that area for the centering? And then last but not least, again, this is super important as well, who could be impacted in this resource, either positively or negatively? So going back to those examples that I showed you before, immediately, right, if I'm thinking about the Georgia math problem fiasco, negative impact would absolutely be for Black students, right? They could negatively be impacted there. If I also think about slavery, right, with that poster, negatively impacted folks from, that might have been enslaved in the past, right, in internment camps, concentration camps, all of that kind of stuff. So these bring back unfortunate memories, right, for folks. And if we think about that too, put yourself in the context of a student that then goes home to their parents and they say, what did you do today? Oh, well, I completed a math problem about slavery. You're going to get a phone call. The school is going to get a phone call, right? That's how all of these things get found out on the internet. We want to make sure that we're leaning with positive intent. Positive intent can sometimes have a negative impact, but that's why we vet our resources, right? We need to make sure that this is being done. So with that being said, this is how we kind of begin, and this is how I start. So if I get a resource, these are like my 5 categories that I check for whenever I do something. But I do this because here's what we're not going to do. We are not going to unintentionally harm our learners, right? Even though we have positive intent can unfortunately can have some negative impact, right? We're also not going to be intentionally harming our learners. I said earlier that I've seen some crazy stuff, and I'll give you a very specific example. I once witnessed a teacher in a special education classroom working with a student who was special education and ELL, and she literally turned to him and said, "What, is your English not working today? I can't believe you're going so slow. Are you really that stupid?" Those were her exact words. And she and I had words afterwards because that was intentional. Why would an adult ever say that to a child, right? The same way that that man said that to my wife. Why would that be something that came out of his mouth? These things are said because folks want to cause intentional harm. They'll pass it off as jokey or, oh, it was all in jest and da, 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 da. We can't have that, right? We need to really think about our words and what we do and what we say, because that does cause very intentional harm. Another thing is centering whiteness and white experiences at the expense of our students of color. I would love to hear more about women in history besides Betsy Ross, Lady Bird Johnson, right? Like those kind of ones, like Nancy Reagan, right? Those that continuously come up. And again, not to discount the work of those lovely folks, we've had a lot of people in color, right? Across lots of different areas that need to be highlighted. And again, that's intentional on our part, that we can seek out resources that do that. And if we can't find one, we can certainly create one. Also, centering ableism at the experience and expense of our disabled students. This has been getting a lot better in the most recent years. So I'm seeing a lot more, students, with books with wheelchairs, right? They might have different disabilities. Wonder was a hit. I remember when that came out a couple years ago. So we're definitely getting better. It's still not wonderful, but if we can also highlight folks in the disabled community, that is great, right? It's not just about color, it's also about experiences and abilities. And then we're also not going to keep things at the status quo because that's how it's always been done, right? That's how it's always been done is starting to become a bit of a trigger phrase for me. And I say this because it feels like every time I enter spaces and I give ideas and I want to, do work like this, usually folks are on board, but I might have one that will say something along the lines of, well, that's how it's always been done. No. That's how it's always been done. To me, it's laziness. It's an excuse, right? Just because that's how it's always been done, that doesn't mean it has to stay that way. And it shouldn't stay that way if it's causing harm to learners or if it's putting students and families in questionable situations, right? We can't be having any of that. So now let's talk specific strategies. And here are some 4. So once you're kind of past that stage where you're in the thinking, this is where we get into the nitty gritty. So I always think about who may negatively be impacted by a resource, specifically our Black, Brown, and Asian students. I'm just hyper aware of that. So I always run through and just be like, okay, here's the resource, here's what I think, but could it potentially have any negative impact? How can I minimize that impact or completely eliminate it? There are some topics that, quite frankly, are very hard to talk about without somebody being negatively impacted. Things like gender identity, things like sexual identity, things like racism, right? You'll never have a conversation about racism in a classroom and have everybody walking out feeling fine and dandy, right? But you can minimize the negative impacts by taking these things into consideration, opening up the room for honest conversation, but also for you as an anti-racist educator, shutting down topics in conversation that specifically are going to be harmful to your classmates. So I'll give you all an example. When the insurrection at the Capitol happened on the 6th of January, I believe, directly after, I canceled all my class visits and I said, okay, I'm just gonna be here to support. One of my teams did a great job of just allowing students space to talk and think and just vent. There was conversation that was going on where a student called the insurrection fake and premeditated by Democrats and just like all of this weird conspiracy stuff. Instead of letting the student ramble, the teacher actually stopped the student and said that they were causing harm or they could have the potential to cause harm if they were to continue to speak, and that the needs of the many outweigh the wants of the few. And if they wanted to talk to a teacher privately about their thoughts, they are more than welcome to. But that portion of the conversation was not welcome at that time. I was like, I was blown away. It was wonderful, right? And it's okay, of course, to let students have opportunities to speak and share out. But if you know, and if you feel that it's kind of going to the wayside, then there's an opportunity for you to really turn that into a learning moment for your students. And I think that that is extremely important. Also, something you can do is utilize trusted sources from marginalized voices and seek out these voices whenever humanly possible. So if I'm looking at a resource and if I see that it's written by a white man, again, not to discredit the work that white men do, but if I'm looking for Black history, I might want to be looking for like a Black woman, right? Or if it's Women's History Month, I might want to look for another woman, right? Just like something where I'm looking at the sources through an authentic lens. And I think that that's really important here, because if you have a Black history resource and if it's written by someone who isn't part of the Black community, there might be a certain slant there and it might not be coming through with that authentic voice. Another thing that I always like to do is whenever possible, I seek folks out and we will do like Skype in the classroom or we'll do virtual field trips. I recently did a STEM read aloud to a school in Minnesota, and that was super fun. We learned all about science notebooks and scientists of color. And the kids loved it because it was a STEMinist of color reading about STEMinists of color, you know, halfway across the country, which was really nice. And a lot of teachers and educators and authors love to do stuff like that. So if you're kind of interested on getting started, I would definitely check out an opportunity like that. It's really, really fun. And it's a vetted resource because it's an authentic voice coming through. Also, and I've said this before, but it always bears repeating, decenter whiteness, especially white men, whenever people are, the vast majority said yes. And I said, all right, cool. So what we're going to do is a research project. And with this research project, you cannot write about any of the people on this list. You have to find a STEMinist of color. You have to find a woman who is a STEMinist, right? Or you have to find someone, you know, just not a white man. Whew, they threw their tomatoes. They were very, very mad at me because they genuinely did not believe that they could find anybody in that field that wasn't already on the list. And again, I think that this just speaks to, again, that curriculum stronghold that it's had on whiteness in schools. Even with my students, they could not name for me a single STEMinist of color or a single woman besides Marie Curie or Hypatia, because I talk about Hypatia a lot. But I was like, okay, we're going to do this, and I promise everything is going to be okay. We just had the best time researching different figures and thinking about, you know, well, why don't we learn about these in school? Right? Then we start to have conversations about what curriculum means. We start to have conversations about looking for other folks in the field, you know, that don't look like white men. And it was so great to have that opportunity with them because, again, we vetted really together, right? We were able to go through, select folks, and have a great time doing research and finding out about their lives. Now, again, curriculum aligned, right? Because we're learning about things, but also at the same time, we are taking a look at what it means outside of the realm of our immediate curriculum. And then lastly, I'm always a big fan of leveraging student input on resources and activities. If a student gives you feedback where maybe they feel that a lesson just wasn't hitting it, right? Or maybe they feel like they were harmed, don't discount that. I always advise for people to take that to heart, because if a student feels brave enough to reach out to you in order to share things with you about how they felt a resource went, then that's really important, and you should definitely leverage that with your strategies. Something I also do with groups of students is that when we have a resource that we're trying to look at, I'll give it to them as a preliminary screening before we start the lesson or before we start the work group. When I do that, it gives them the opportunity to really prepare themselves, right? And take a look at the resource. That way we can get any questions out of the way beforehand, and then we can come together as a class and work collaboratively. So these are kind of some more detailed strategies that you can go into when you're vetting things through that anti-racist lens. Because again, if we're focused on dismantling these structures that are harmful for schools and students, students also actively need to be part of that conversation too. Oops. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing this. And real quick, I'm going to show you a resource, especially with vetting. There are a lot of really cool things that are out there, but I do think that it's important to give a shout out to one that is doing great, great, great work. And if any of you, of course, are interested in using this platform, it's called Buncee. I don't know how many of you have used Buncee, But I have just been so impressed with their work with anti-racism, with Black History Month. They have Women's History Month slides that are coming up. I mean, I am just blown away. So I would feel remiss if I didn't show you. That way you have kind of like a takeaway platform if you wanted to use it. So I'm going to go ahead and share this screen right here. And the best way that I can describe Buncee is that it's kind of like PowerPoint 2.0. Like there's just lots of cool things you can do with it. You can add video, you can add audio, you can do QR codes. It's just super duper neat. But when you log into Buncee, up at the top right, there's this ideas lab right here. These are pre-made, already vetted activities and resources by teachers, for teachers. It's just super duper cool. So again, these resources are vetted through that lens, which is great. But if you also wanted to add more to it, you could as well. So you'll see that there's quite a bit that's already here. There's 785 that you can select from, which is wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. And you'll already see a couple that are already there for Women's History Month, right? Research projects, women's suffrage timelines. So I'll actually focus on that because there's stuff that I personally can add to that. But if you wanted to filter by your content area, so let's say I'll do social studies. I'll vet through social studies. And then for the grade level, I'll do elementary school. You'll notice that there's about 62 that I can select from. And just really, really neat stuff that you can do with your students that are already vetted and made. But if you wanted to change anything, so like, let's go back. If I wanted to do women's suffrage movement timeline, what it does is it creates a copy for you. It's pretty neat how they set it out with suffrage movements, right? What does it mean? Dates and timelines, more dates and timelines, blah, blah, blah. What I would personally do, and I don't know if any of you follow suffrage history super duper well, but there were two actually different movements. There was one for the Black suffragettes and there was one for the white female suffragettes. So what I would do here in this case is I would specifically outline spaces for students to put in movements of the Black timeline, right? And also for the Indigenous timeline, because those are often overlooked when we think about the suffrage movement at large. But again, it's pretty easy or simple to go back and change, because then what I can do is I can add, right? So for insert text, I might say add a Black suffrage date, right? So that way my students know that I'm not just focusing on one particular suffrage movement, but I'm also keeping everything in mind too. They've got a lot that's content driven. They've also got some that are month driven. They're having a rockin' Black History Month right now. We have Women's History Month next month. I mean, they just really knock it out of the park. So when I think vetting resources through that lens, Buncee is one of the first ones that come to mind because there's just so much available. If any of y'all use Pear Deck is really neat too. So that's kind of like an active virtual PowerPoint. Pear Deck is neat because you can go through and students can respond in live time. And you can do similar things to Buncee where you can adjust, change, all that stuff, and the kids love it. If you follow me on social media, you'll know very quickly that I'm a big Pear Deck fan. Alrighty. So with the 6 minutes that we have left to spare, I'm gonna go ahead and throw up the thank you slide. It's got my Twitter handle on there if you'd like to connect or anything like that. And I'm, again, just so excited to be here with y'all today. Thank you so much. And this is important, not just for our professional growth as educators, but also for our students as well, because we want to do the best for them. We also want to do the best for our growth. So I hope you learned something and I'll take questions if we have any.
Victoria, I have one really quick. If you have a link to your slide deck or resources, could you throw that into the chat, please?
Ooh, that's a great question. I have to turn it into a bit.ly first, but can I share it? Would the Q Palooza website be the best way?
I'll send you an email and you can just respond to me.
Okay, great. Thanks, Lisa.
And I'm going to go ahead and stop recording now. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. That's fine.
The entire day to go and reflect.
Oh, host, you're going to have to